16 When you wish upon a star. Another hazy day in Galvanite. Barry went down and had some fruit and yogurt. He went out into town. He walked through the streets. The old houses were yet more reticent than they had been, the town yet more deserted seeming. Not even a sign of a lumpen proletariat to clutter the desolation. How much longer? How much longer? He walked to where the church had crumbled the other day. He walked into the damp rubble. It seemed to have shrunk since yesterday. He navigated to where the pulpit would have been. He turned to look at the view facing what would have been the congregation. The squat darkness of the saloon across the street was like a small rectangular spot of tumorous fungus upon a landscape of lonely emptiness. Empty loneliness. Barry didn't have time for this shit. Galvanite, you had your chance. And you blew it? He walked towards the beach. Without looking for anything in particular, he came upon an old dark house he hadn't noticed before, crowned with steeples caving in under the weight of ivy. He vaulted the rusted gate and walked up to the moldering door. It stank of woodrot. He kicked it into 1,000 splinters. He stepped into the stinking, moldering hallway. He approached the unstable, wood-rotting stairs. He leapt to the top in a single bound. The stairs collapsed for no reason. He turned a stinking corner to enter the rotting master bedroom. A giant, stinking black widow spider, the size of an adult human, sat on a rotting wooden stool in the center of the room. It was turned towards the door, awaiting his coming. The room stank of a longing like he had never smelled before, a hollow longing so profound it overpowered even the woodrot. This was a longing that had percolated for centuries, in much the same process as the brilliance that had aged like a fine wine within the piano. And in its own sick and powerless way, this longing was just as strong, just as potent. It was a powerlessness so powerful, it broke down all barriers, all barriers. The spider seemed immune to it. Perhaps it had grown accustomed. You'll never find satisfaction this way, you know, it said to Barry nonchalantly. Barry strode across the room and delivered a standing side kick that sent it flying out a yellowed, mostly broken window and a good ways into the front yard, where it landed in a shady spot, its back meeting the turf with a thump. He turned towards the direction of the boardwalk and, launching himself into the air, did a flying jump kick clean through the second-story wall, sending 10,000 damp, harmless splinters in all directions. He landed in an easy crouch on the front lawn not far from the spider, and quickly regaining his stride, jumped over the fence and marched onwards. The spider, well dazed, propped itself on its elbows and turned to watch Barry, just in time to see him disappear down the street. It shook its head. After another day of demonstrations, the trio sat down at a generic local taco parlor to eat their cheese enchiladas. Dining in Galvanite was dragging on Barry's soul. "Okay, listen," said Drip Dry. The group leaned their heads closer in. "I'm not telling anything to the Tourism Association. I bought a used carriage and 2 speed mules from an associate. I'm well connected in town," he didn't ask questions. "The speed mules should be good animals. The carriage has plenty of feed and water. It's a rickety old carriage. It should be fine to get us to West Pueblo City, at which time we can hopefully find Barry's group. They'll have to be pretty incompetent not to make it to this tournament. Pardoilios, if you could act as coachman, that would be ideal. We will be heading straight through the dangerous arid regions between the coast and the desert proper. The good news is that I have intimate familiarity of where towns are located. At least I haven't heard of any towns going out of existence since I last visited. When I say towns I mainly mean outposts, where we can keep stocked on our provisions. I put a conservative estimate for reaching West Pueblo City at a week and a half. A lot can happen in that time. It's a risk. But it's worth it. I have the carriage stabled at the Grande Old Galvanite Inn, so we should meet at the stable there at dawn and head straight out. Everyone got it? I'm down, said Pardoilios. Let's do this thing. Barry approached the hotel for the last time. He looked up at it. It was grande indeed. Well preserved. Yet it didn't feel like it was from out of another era. It merely felt well preserved. He looked towards the ocean. A light haze. Someday, the haze would come in force, and carry the tattered remains of Galvanite off to some world of pale longing. Then there would be nothing left but the saloons and the lumpen proletariat, milling about in a landscape of shallow dunes, and they wouldn't notice a change. He walked into the lobby. This time, the pianist was back at the keys, but a different small group, more businesslike, was clinking glasses and murmuring to one another. Barry sat down to listen. The small group turned to look at him. It was as if they had been waiting to do this, as if it had been orchestrated. He looked back at them. They looked. He looked. They looked. He looked. They looked. He looked. One of them looked away briefly, then looked right back, as if to psych him. He looked. They looked. He looked. And they looked at him, and he looked at them, and he thought of all the beauty, all the grace and prowess that this piano had paid witness to, and now these idiots were standing there thinking that it was all for them. They thought these things belonged to them, when it was obvious to anyone that they wouldn't know the true meaning of the things if it went up and bit them on the ass. They had been told. And they thought as they were told. And Barry sparred a moment of pity for them. They looked. He looked. And the pianist played on, and he was a little better than the night before, and when it became clear even to them that their looking was having no effect, they went on with their muttering and chortling, and their finishing of their glasses and getting of another. And the piano played. It really played. And Barry reflected, that without something as sad and miserable and seemingly worthless as the pale longing of Galveston, there could never really be something like this Steinway, that was great in a way no ghost could ever be. If there weren't two things, there could be, would be, nothing. And Barry felt a modicum of solace, a quantum of contentment. And then the pianist, tired stiff, finally stopped. And the group guffawed in their triviality, and Barry felt pity without having to set a moment aside for it. And he went up, and opened the door, and climbed into bed, and slept. And slept. And dreamt. He was gliding free and easy across the lunar skyscape, his mood effervescent as a sparrow on the wing, or a mineral water on one's birthday. The surface below was like luminous cheddar sculpted into a treeless facsimile of the great western mountains. A ravine came into view. He dived. He could feel the guiding strings of the witch of last night. Got something real useful, dearie. You're gonna love it. Somehow, his heart knew to accept the challenge. The ravine deepened. And deepened. It became darker, the luminosity of the walls to either side becoming a dull yellow ochre glow in the depths. Deeper, farther. Even the glow was fading. As it was becoming almost imperceptible, a spot of baleful orange light appeared ahead and below. He went towards it. It was a ragged tunnel into the pure moonstone of the chasm floor, slanting diagonally downwards. He entered its confines and, even in his incorporeal dream form, felt a sort of odd moon heat, like unto lunar Hades in the moon's moon heart. It was a heat that penetrated in a subtle way, without scorching the outside before hitting the inside, but not like radioactive heat, that caused the inside to rot away. Rather, in moderation, this moon heat of the moon heart could be beneficial, to the right audience. He followed the tunnel. Tunneling without sign of end. Then, as he was getting accustomed to not waiting for an end, the tunnel opened into a massive pit. Looking up, he saw a moonstone roof was not far overhead. This pit was not easily accessible to the surface. He looked to the sides and down, no other clear entrances. Now the baleful orange was fading to a dark orange red that got redder and darker the farther down the pit went. He floatingly descended. Gradually, the pit widened. After a while, the sides developed ledges which supported great craggy stalagmites. Where the moisture came from, Barry couldn't say. Perhaps the moon heat caused the moonstone to sweat like cheese, and this sweat accrued in piles in the strangeness of lunar gravitation. Finally, after nearly as long as the tunnel trip, he came to the dark floor of the pit. The atmosphere was still and baleful in this great rocky plain. The walls were far, but visible. The topography of the bottom was one of desolation. Nothing had stirred for eons, and it would continue so for eons more, he reckoned. There was only one distinguishing point, an imposing dark moonstone double door not far from where he landed, flanked by great ledges of stalactites rising grandly up, in atmosphere like some entryway to the hall of a mountain king, or a Hadean haunt of baleful bandits. This spot stood out starkly from all its surroundings. Above the door was a colorful sign. In bright, flourished neon cursive, it elaborately but classily spelled out, Club Bazaar. Try the door, dearie, the powerful witch telepathically told Barry. The great double door opened with a cyclopean creaking, a sepulchral scraping, an eon groan and a small shower of dark moonstone powder dust. And the strange light was upon him. The air was pumping with the vibrations of entrancing electronic techno sounds, but the atmosphere was laid back, in the same sense as the best coffee shops, an ambience that was casual, yet thrumming with ideas. And more than ideas. Inspiration. Because Barry quickly saw that within the crowd, there was a practical who's who of arcane and archaic studies. It was a hopping joint. Judging by the unique physiognomies of many in the crowd, he guessed that there might even be arcane scholars and scientists from across the galactic sector. He could not overlook a bust of Finklin that sat above the bar. No other demigods were portrayed anywhere in the bar. Barry was too heretical by nature to pay much heed to theology. Did Finklin have some interest in arcane studies? Hard to imagine. It was probably his association with adventure that made him a fitting figurehead. Other than that, the decor was fairly sparse. The interior decoration plan of Club Bazaar emphasized the clientele, not the digs. Nearly entranced by the music and the atmosphere, enchanted despite himself to discover such scintillating scholarly culture near the center of the moon, Barry made his way like one awake, winding towards the bar counter as he glanced through the crowd. The bar had a few alcoholic items, and more cannabinoid ones, but its main focus was on eclectic herbals of every sort. Barry didn't have to think about what he wanted. A slightly octopoid barkeep poked into view. "Get me a ginseng tea, my good fellow," said Barry, without looking away from the crowd. He had a feeling this was a good place for 100-year-old good. "My fine man. If you had even the slightest notion of the drinks I've tolerated, you would have no doubt that 100-year-old is good enough for me." The barkeep plopped it down. "Hot water taps over there when you want more," he said, pointing a facet tendril. "One moment. Before I drink this, I don't have any way to remunerate you for it." "Legal tender? In a dream club? Faith and begorra, pray to the demigods of the infinite corners it never comes to that. There'll be hell to pay. No, rest assured, good gentlemen, we do this because we like to do it. Bless you, friend. And might I ask who the venerable we of this distinguished establishment is?" "You might. But you'll do better to ask over there." Barry followed the direction of his face tendril. Leaning against a high round table, the powerful witch was lost in conversation with drip-dry eyes. "Thanks upon thanks, and this tea is exquisite," he told the barkeep between sips. "Demigod willing, you haven't seen the last of me." The barkeep waved a friendly face tendril, and Barry was through the crowd. He nearly brushed shoulders with an arcane mineralogist. He would have dearly loved to attempt to engage in discussion, but he couldn't get distracted. This was a remarkable thing. The whole establishment was remarkable, so much so that he felt he must be awake but to guide drip-dry eyes, for all intents and purposes a legendary yet ultimately earthly wrestler, into a highly disciplined dream space. There was much Barry did not understand. And he was prepared to do something about it. Drip-dry turned. "Barry, you've come. This is really an amazing pleasure. Barry was deeply ashamed of his amusement in noting that Drip Dry was clearly doing his level best not to let his tongue hang out too much in a display of panting. The poor fellow was still self-conscious, even after all his success. "It's all new to me." Yes, it was the real Drip Dry, Barry was certain. "Yes, and doubly surprising, I'm sure," the witch said, "for one who isn't used to disciplined dreaming. A common misconception is that dreaming is a function of the mind inherently at odds with any practice of scholarly discipline. I'm afraid this speaks darkly about the ordinary human understanding of what discipline is." "I couldn't agree more," said Barry, "and it's a fascinating subject. But tell me, my good witch Ipu, what is the function of this club? How did you know Drip Dry Eyes and I are in cahoots these days? And what is the purpose," he took a sip, "other than some phenomenal beverages, of bringing us both here? What's your game, witch Ipu?" "Witch Ipu yourself," said the witch. "I know this is sudden, but you don't gotta be an arsehole about it. The purpose is really just to be a hangout for arcane people. The name Club Bazaar is kinda ironic. It's slightly strange that it's inside the moon, that you have to be dreaming, that there's magical people from other planets. But actually, when you boil it all down, it's a pretty ordinary club. What brings people here isn't any kind of special kick, other than arcane scholarship. Kinda a shame, really. Some fetish stuff could be way more interesting." "I know this shows how straight-laced I am," Drip Dry said, "but I find it pretty interesting as is. I mean, I don't know anything about this kind of stuff, but there must be some really consequential conversations to the world of arcana that take place in these walls." "Yeah, I guess." The witch wrinkled her crone nose. "Actually, most arcane scholars are not that interesting to talk to. A lot of times all they think about is themselves and how important whatever they're studying is. Pretty lame, to be honest. Which is why I was excited when this asshole she motioned to Barry got on the short list, because his mycological work is actually doing something worthwhile. If enderines and the other compounds get going, it could really help break the mental shackles of central government slaves, so long as it can be administered. And that's basically the only way we know of to ever weaken any central government anywhere. You've got to get through to the chumps. Which is the hardest thing in the world. So when I heard Drip Dry Eyes, one of my favorite wrestlers from On Hollow broadcast back in the day, great bod even now, by the way, when I heard that you were helping, I said, get him in here. Because this is really a main part of the plan. If you guys get separated, you can meet up here in Dream. And you can discuss things here, without being overheard out there. Unfortunately, that big baldo you've got chauffeuring you is just too plain stupid to get here yet. But I checked on him, and he's not a spy. Not that I'd be better at figuring that out than you, but peer reviews and all. Look, said Drip Dry. This is great. I'm thrilled you want to help us. But there's something you've got to realize. We don't know anything about you. You come out of nowhere, stark naked, and start in on how you're on our side and want to give us all this free help, seemingly at great expense on your part. Now, I hate to look a gift horse in the mouth. But you must see how this could be misinterpreted. So the question is, what, exactly, is your true motive? I want to buy it, but he narrowed his eyes. What's you game, witchy? First off, the witch said with assumed gravity, I don't know where you come off with this stark naked stuff, acting like that little yellow speedo is hiding anything. What does that have to do with anything anyway? Second Barry held up a hand. Hold one moment, you two. I agree with the good witch. Besides, you both have no cause to be ashamed of your bodies. Drip Dry put his head down slightly, but it's perhaps moot, because I've just recognized our benefactor. I hate to admit how amateur a dream traveler I am. But it's true, I had a normal muddling dream blockage preventing me from immediately identifying a face I don't see often. Drip Dry, this is none other than San Wordle. She's one of the foremost practitioners of Wiccan arts and sciences working today, both on a practical and a scholarly level. That's right, said San. Is the sausage patrol finally up to speed? Can we move forward a little? It should be obvious to anyone why my peers at Club Bazaar, the whole arcane community, even the most insular basement-dwelling do-nothing and indeed the world, would want Barry to have success in his quest for Jazzy Jayhawk. The central government uses explosive alchemy, one of if not the stupidest form, to cause massive destruction to its rivals. You just really have to see these guys at work to understand how stupid it is. Of course it was developed before almost anything else. First alchemists found out they couldn't literally just turn lead into gold, because they were too stupid to know what symbolism and metaphor were. Then they made things go boom, and that became the main point. During this time, witchcraft basically went entirely underground. Frustrated that they couldn't ever find us, the central government began just killing random innocents, calling them witches for made-up reasons. It was really an ugly sight. We naturally allowed apothecarists, basically just glorified shop owners, to co-opt our arts, because we didn't want seriously ill people to have no chance at ever getting helpful medicine. You should have seen the messed up stuff those apothecaries led to. Well, the course of history became such a mess that it would take forever to even cover the bases. But the bottom line is, the central government realized it had two things going for it: making things go boom, and having lots of brainless goons. It couldn't rightly just make its whole populace go boom whenever it didn't like what they were doing. Pretty soon it wouldn't have many citizens left. That left it with the brainless goons option. In this scenario, if you're a central government, your best bet is to create the impression that there's one type of alchemy, explosive alchemy, and that's basically it. You want your goons to have smooth sailing, and other types of alchemy can just be outlawed. Before long, they had weapons of destruction so terrible it's inconceivable. If the central government ever returns, not only will it put an end to our fields of study being able to operate out in the open, it will all but definitely usher in another time of the hungry ghosts. And that would definitely suck. It would at that, said Barry. And it's no shock that San and others might have guessed I was onto something big. I keep in regular correspondence with other scholars, both personally and through publications. It likely traveled up the grapevine to San. Traveled up the grapevine? What, am I some douche who has my people make little summaries for me of everything that's going on out in the big scary world? I read your stuff for myself. I'm flattered. Don't be. I didn't read them to get your ego off. I read them because they're good. Mycology is a great subject. And it's obvious to anyone who's been paying a bit of attention that this research has the potential to finally reverse the mutation that causes mental barriers in the minds of central government goons. She turned to Drip Dry. Who, remember, 9 times out of 10, have been led to believe that they hate the central government, even as they scrupulously do its bidding. There's no hope of conventionally reasoning with them. The mental barriers themselves have to come down. Great, said Drip Dry, but one thing's been bugging me. Where's Jazzy Jayhawk? This is a quest to find Jazzy Jayhawk. He's a great scholar. This place is for great scholars. Invite him. Quest over? Or not? He lifted his hand palms up in a wavery shrug. Excellent, said Barry, nodding approval. You just said it, said San. Why not get a hold of Jayhawk? Why not correspond with him? Get him on a hololink? Someone just find where he is and have someone go tell him something important is up? He's smart, why hasn't he got a hold of Barry? That's the thing. We can't contact Jayhawk. We can't connect in dreams. He'll write a brilliant article every now and then, but nobody knows where he mails it from. He's been traveling from place to place faster than anyone can keep up with. He definitely must know that Barry's sitting on something incredible. The Endirine's research is really just the most socially important, the the most important, but there are directions here that could lead to cracking the power of the mushroom wide open. Anything is possible, who knows what's at stake. But Jayhawk is a complete mystery. It really is insane that he's virtually necessary to speed this research along. He has the secrets to strengthening the concentrates, allowing for worldwide distribution. We've seen time and again that he's the one with the knowledge and expertise. It should just be anybody's discovery to make, but every time, he'll come out with something it takes us 5 years just to understand. Somehow, he really does hold all the cards. No one else can finish this research in our lifetime. I'd bet my bottom dollar he'll finish it within a month. Crazy, said Drip Dry. All I knew was that he's the toughest wrestler. For going on 12 years now, as you know, said San. That ain't natural. And with that, I've gotta check with some other people. But remember, you can get here any evening. Now that you know where it is, just go right here. Barry, you may want to help Drippy at first, to get used to it. And since it's dream time, she said to Drip Dry, it won't take too long or interrupt your other dreaming to an unhealthy degree. Still, I recommend not spending more than 2 cents hours, not that I could ever spend that long talking to most of the clientele without falling awake. Till next time, losers. And she walked off through the crowd. Quite a woman, Barry said after San had left. He swished his ginseng around the bottom of the cup. He didn't need any more tea, and he knew he'd be back here all the time, plus he was literally asleep. It's not like he was getting much benefit from the root's properties. But this was so good that he had to get some more hot water. He looked over. Drip Dry was still looking intently in the direction San had left. 17 horseplay nights. The ragged wagon bounced and jerked along the dusty road. On either side, short dunes stretched off into the distance. It was a hazy morning. Pardoilio sat tiredly in front, keeping an eye on the speed mules. He yawned periodically. Inside, Drip Dry and Barry consulted maps. So if we stay on time, we should make an inn every 2 or 3 nights until the final stretch. Then, it's desert. But the highway is straight and clear. As long as we have plenty of water and just keep moving, we can blaze through the miles. That is, if there are no desert tribe ambushes. A big if. Well, we'll just see. Say, what did you think of the place last night? Yes. Club Bazaar did really happen, and we shared in the dream. Drip Dry put his hand to his head. That was so weird, I almost hoped it didn't. But that's good. It gives us another tool. Why do you suppose you were never let in on it before? And why make it so hush-hush? Not hard to imagine. The caliber of some of the faces I recognized was of the highest. It's an honor to be let in there now. But, based on my reading of San Wordle's many excellent scholarly works, I have a feeling anything she's so strongly associated with, it seemed like her baby, honestly isn't any kind of social hierarchy snob fest. I wouldn't be surprised if the true criteria is the potential of researches to increase societal well-being. It would need to be kept secret to avoid jealous snobs imperiling its functionality, bringing hierarchy games in, or retaliating when they felt left out. But that's just a guess. I'm excited mainly for its ability to let us confer if we get split up, as long as we're sleeping at the same time. Yeah. If we can't get to sleep, it's no deal. Which is why we should maintain good sleep schedules at all times. Absolutely. Circumstances may prevent it, but if we know on average that our sleep schedules are roughly synchronous, it will come natural to us to meet up at the right time, even when our situation changes. Crazy. Well, I'm getting spooked just talking about the place. I just had to make sure it wasn't me dreaming it all. Smart. But you're right. Getting too wrapped up in dream can be very disorienting. Barry looked out the window. Little dunes for miles and miles. The light was becoming clearer. Soon they'd be away from the coast and the haze, and in a landscape and a light far, far removed from the nocturnal. The heat of the dog days still lingered down here, and would likely linger for at least 2 weeks longer. It was the most tenacious, vindictive season. But the seasons would change before long, and he'd miss the beauty of the T-town autumn. But who knew where he'd end up, before autumn was done? Drab hours of driving stretched out. Barry was lulled into relaxation by the sight of the dunes, but they transitioned into sparse, dusty plains, giving an even drabber vista upon which to contemplate. Drip Dry seemed to be reserving energy. After the initial morning yawn fest, Pardoilios tended the speed mules with stoic, almost contented reserve. At lunch, they stretched briefly, took care of nature's call in the scrubs, and ate cans of beans, before heading back out within 15 minutes. Pardoilios took the reins again without questioning. Good man, thought Barry. He pulls his own weight. As late afternoon pulled around, there was some issue over gaseous emissions from the coachman's seat. This is what we have to look forward to every day for nearly 2 weeks, Drip Dry said in doleful lamentation. There was much merry-making. The light began to fade early enough to take Barry off guard, as if it wasn't the result of gradual season change, but had struck out of nowhere. As soon as summer really starts to transition, mused Drip Dry, even while it's still hot, you really notice the days shrink. If you squint, you can see the ruins of the great old metropolis to the north. Around dinner time, we should be arriving at the outpost where the Lank Grass Inn is situated. They have a pretty lively saloon, there may be some gossip worth checking on. But be wary. The notoriously smelly, overstuffed denizens of this arid region are known to be prone to violence with little to no provocation. They play at being hard-boiled, when in actuality, they tend towards the vain and emotional. But they can be reasoned with, if the proper demeanor is maintained. I hear there are many lumpen proletariat in this region, said Barry. Drip Dry looked out the window, scanning for ruins. You saw them in Galvanite, no doubt. We won't be done with them until we're well out of the region. This area is one of their main nests, it would seem. How they reproduce, I'm not sure I fully understand. It seems I'm naive to these lower, less clean ways of life. But most of the lumpen are harmless, so long as they're left to their own devices. They don't seem to be as prone to taking up thieving as they used to. For whatever reason, their way of life seems to be less demanding of such tactics. If the lumpen proletariat can be less active, it seems they generally will. And it's true most violence they inflict is on one another. But they are volatile. I have to confess, Drip Dry, that I have a really reprehensible prejudice against those that fall into this condition. Drip Dry smiled. I sympathize. But who would choose such an existence? After the fact, it's natural for them to tell themselves, this is my choice, a freedom-loving way of life, even as everything proves otherwise. Such is human nature. Yet, it's all a lie. Factors bring the lumpen pro to their ignoble position, and though it may be impossible to reason with them, we should remember, even as we view them with a liberal dose of sensible caution, that they still possess at least a modicum of humanity. When we fail to see this, it's we who are the monsters. You couldn't be more right. But my loathsome prejudice persists. I won't let it go at that. I believe the root cause of it is that, just as you said, you can't reason with lumpen proletariat. And I find that particularly reprehensible. Add to that the total disregard of honor exhibited by them on a regular basis. It's okay, normal, human to have such feelings. But you can't let them override your own judgment, reason, and sense of honor. Then where would you be? Human, all too human, perhaps. Yes. 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 Barry steepled his fingers, contemplating, wrestling. Rasselio problems. As fine as the inn was, it will do me good to sleep a night outside of Galvanite. I believe that place might have seeped into me a bit. He turned his head sharply to look out the window. But there's no sense blaming the place. To the lank grass inn, and then tomorrow, forward, forward, down the road, always forward. That's the spirit, said Drip Dry encouragingly. They both watched out their respective windows as the light faded on the drab, arid, scraggly plains. The outpost was sparse and utilitarian, wood shacks with simple signs, people with simple faces. A few lonely residences sat a short walk outside the central hub. At the very center, a water pump sat. The inn was nearby, containing the stables for the outpost. The water pump and the inn were the twin suns this micro-community orbited, not only spatially, but spiritually. The trio looked up at the entrance to the inn. Sounds of music reverberated from its doors even when closed. The excuse of commerce had allowed the desert dwellers to lavish a repressed imagination on the place that they'd never allow themselves to show otherwise. This, Barry reflected, was perhaps the true heart of the love of commerce he felt in communities like this. The balsam facade was carved into spiraling eddies of color. Back on the edge of the central plains, the Jacques Immerns Inn had been more elaborate in its design, but it was an imitation of swampland decadence, meaning to convey to flabby patrons that they could find cheap pleasures to distract their sad, threadbare hearts. The lank grass inn only possessed abstract geometric multicolored swirls in an expressionistic layout. Yet in that inoffensive facade, Barry saw the genuine version of what Jacques Immerns, a better-known establishment, had only been able to distantly imitate, without any real feeling what even the famous Neo-Zoo had only really had on occasion. Here, in the arid plains that made up the desert before the desert, was a full display of the genuine spirit of frolic. "Looks like a happening joint," said Drip Dry. "Don't worry," said Pardoilios, "I won't gamble. But I hear they have great live shows." "We'll find out soon enough," said Barry. "Let's get checked in." They burst through the batwing doors at almost the same instant. The funky music was intoxicating. The spacious hall was lit with colored lights from many chandeliers with frilly fabric domes. The floor was divided between open dance space, empty for the moment, and little wooden tables. At the far end, a stage stood, classic musicale in design. The clientele had bloated types, but not as many as Barry would have thought. People from all walks of life seemed to be drawn here. There was scampering around the bar. The trio strolled over. "The show's gonna start soon," a patron helpfully said to Drip Dry. Now there was scampering as everyone returned to their seats. The trio awkwardly balanced their drinks and snacks and found an unclaimed table near the back. The lights dimmed very slightly, the spotlights on the stage brightened it to a tasteful degree. Conversations grew more hushed, took on the tone of anticipation. And out they trotted. In body, they were exceptionally fit, and moved with stamina. They wore all sorts of vests and half-jackets of eclectic design, from shiny black leather with odd diagonal buckle arrangements, to white feathers poofing out all over, to shimmering rainbow tunics with short puff sleeves, and much more elaborate decoration besides. They wore nothing else. They twirled with the grace of ballet dancers, but they were prodigiously endowed, male and female alike, and some appeared to have both equipment types, being prodigious in both ways. Most had well-manicured body hair, some possessed little or none, while others manicured it into shapes, like a shrubbery display. And indeed, much of the hair, both on the head and below it, was shrub-like in its protuberating abundance, with the afro form of hairdo, in all sizes, being common. The most startling thing, though, was their heads. Drip Dry Eyes would never tolerate any differently headed people being ogled or objectified, to his eternal credit, Barry knew. But these heads were striking. They were of the horse mold. Some were nearly as much horse form as Drip Dry was dachshund form, with the varying humanoid flesh tones being the main difference. But others were long, snouty heads in the shape of horses, but maintaining basically normal human nose shapes, lip shapes, and other physiognomy traits, just stretched to fit the horse frame. In these, the eyes, distinctly more forward-facing than that of a horse, were really large and striking, with massive, brightly colored, almost luminous irises and come-hither pupils that spoke of deep mysteries that one had to be a little brave, maybe a little foolish, to experience. It made Barry feel young again to see them prance and twirl in a burlesque more artistic than he realized the form could be, like viewing a garden more beautiful than could be imagined, because more volatile, more dangerous, with the dangerous volatility of a human life which was all the dangerous volatility the universe could contain. They pranced, they whirled, they capered and cavorted in a perfect burlesque manifestation of the spirit of frolic. Barry noticed that clever colored lighting combined with subtle set painting made the backdrop appear as a clear blue sky on a spring day, so that these horsey dancers were truly like flowers in bloom. The pitch of the humming, minimalistically symphonic music rose slightly, the tempo slowed ever so slightly. The dancers circled one another. Then they knelt in a perfect circle on the stage. Their faces lifted up to the ceiling, a perfect gradient from horse-like to practically horse, and back again. Their enviable endowments faced one another towards the center, unabashed. They lifted up their heads, opened their mouths, and out came sustained notes, a different note for each different voice. And with the notes, came billows of differently colored smoke, like plumes arising from a sacred incense. Censer. A singer, a note, a color of smoke. 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 No two the same. The music faded to nothing, as the circle sustained its notes with perfect pitch. "Where do they get these guys?" whispered Pardolios. Drip Dry put up a hand in the universal hold off on the jabber sign. "Oh," Pardolios nodded in assent. The notes tapered into silence, and there was dead silence in the music-hall. As the notes ended, the smoke became more vibrant in color, came out even more voluminously who knew from what seemingly inexhaustible inner source, and then it got more vibrant, and more, and more, and more vibrant, and more vibrant, and more vibrant, and more vibrant, and more, and more, and more, and more, and more, and more, and more vibrant, until it was so bright it almost hurt the eyes, and then it really was incense, then it was filling the capacious hall with the aroma of exotic and luscious fragrances of a magnificent garden, just like the one promised by the bodies on stage, a garden with the perfumes of youth, of spring, of open spaces and free and easy living, of healthy and hearty endowments with no thought or knowledge of jealousies, a vital and dangerous Arcadia of a people so human, but a people all their own, who basked in the sunlight and knew nothing of the sickliness of the repressed, a volatile Arcadia, ready to blow itself up with a smile at any moment. And it was a fantasy, it was a dream, in this time and place perhaps, but Barry knew that this was no pure fiction, that this was based on a true story. The smoke was now blanketing the stage, and the dancers rose, the smoke weighing weightlessly on their ascending bodies that, for a moment, were impossibly languorous. It was like the rise from a golden nap under the tree of knowledge. Barry was electrified, despite himself. The nude dancers were not languorous for long, because now the music was picking up, and they pranced down the sides of the stage with a sense of purpose. As they pranced and swayed between tables, with some audience members unashamedly swooning, Barry saw they were making for the dance floor. The music was funky, it was going, like, really going. And as they came to the dance floor, they glanced playfully over their shoulders and they neighed. They neighed, but that neigh was more human than most yells. It had the all-too-human suggestion of "yeah, let's go." And the bolder patrons began to get up. Drip Dry was on his feet. Then most of the crowd was getting up. And finally, even Barry had to get up and be a part of the dance. He went out. Sure enough, Drip Dry was near the center of the fray, dancing with a fine young filly. The bass deepened, intensifying. Drip Dry always put on a straight-laced persona. But even from knowing him such a short time, it was beginning to seem to Barry that all his near-ascetic efforts had left him repressed. To do what he had been doing for the last 8 years would have taken an element of self-denial. Now, It seemed like he was ready to let go a little, ready to be brave and live again. Life after heartbreak. Barry smiled. But all this rigmarole was wearing him out. He got his fill of boogie in, then turned to the table, where Pardoilios still sat. He joined him. "Man," said Pardoilios, looking at the crowd, "y'all bring me to some crazy places." "This may be just the beginning, friend," said Barry. The modest room didn't bother Barry in the least after the burlesque madness of the evening. He lay down and thought of lovely gardens. Soon he was in the dream. Morgo was right there. "I will never lie to you," she said. "But there is some truth to what the ignorant say. Dear Barry, because it's hard to explain it. There are dimensions, upon dimensions. Many ways. Many, many ways. Soon. I hope you can see. Few will readily comprehend. But I'd never lie. Never. Please have patience." Barry held out his hand. He wanted to touch Morgo again. To hold her. When he had lost Morgo, he had lost everything. He had become like Gaspordu in some sense. And perhaps, when you thought about it, Gaspordu had become like him. Or, had he? He sat on a desert island. There was Gaspordu, lying on his back, convalescent. Yes. He would have to be cared for. 8 spiders a day should do the trick. Barry dropped a big, juicy spider into Gaspordu's gaping mouth. A sound of whirring metal blades like a garbage disposal. Spider legs flew up from the open mouth, then back down to be consumed. "Yum," said Gaspordu in a machine voice. And then Gaspordu gasped. He gasped. Gasp, 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 gasp. Gasp, 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 pump, 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 pump. A beautiful aroma of 1,000 springs wafted up, and heavenly harps strummed. Barry reached deep into gasp, 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 Gaspordu's throat and pulled out a lovely rose, voted most beautiful in all the land for 10 consecutive years, and he sniffed heavily, like one consuming powdered drugs through the nose, victim privy to nose devils, and experiencing a fine pleasure as of 1,000 youthful pleasures in his smiling heart. Soon it would smell like farts and jockstrap tails for another day mayhap. Gaspordu. Gaspordu gasping with malicious mirth. Gasp, gasp, passed gas. Gad. He passed gas all over the good times. Or had he? He had many games and many hands, and now he lay convalescent, felled by Barry's spinning pile driver. Oh, all ye heinous incantations. Oh ye howling dark chasms and ye dimensional voices. Ye plasms, chant with me, for a growing boy needs his milk. So Barry chanted, he chanted under his breath, closed his eyes, and swayed slightly. Or did he? Then he was back at the entryway of Club Bazaar. He looked down. His palms were sweaty. Thank goodness. Drip Dry and San were already chatting it up. Drip Dry motioned for Barry to come over. "San's got some news." "So I do, Drip. I found someone you might wanna speak to. He's right over there." She motioned to a nearby table. Leaning his elbows against it was Marcel. "Phenomenal work," said Barry. "This is excellent. Thank you, San. You're like a magical pixie dream godmother from out of nowhere. Good one." "But there's more to Marcel than meets the eye," said San with a smile. It was he that took the initiative, searching Dreamworld for Wiccan help. No normal pest walker can do that. Nodding, Barry went over to Marcel. He turned. "Barry, man, it's good to see you. This is awesome. This place is so amazing. I'm so down with this." He shook his head in disbelief. "Amazing. It's an impressive dream feat," conceded Barry. "It seems it's a sort of Dreamtime consortium of arcane experts." San and Drip Dry had drifted over. "But not very good ones mostly," said San. "Drippy has told me about you guys' evening. It's sad when your dreams are more boring than your actual evening. We are getting performance in here if it kills me.
Wonderful, I'm sure, said Barry, there can never be too much dancing around. But my main concern is how the T-Town caravan is doing. I trust you guys are heading to West Pueblos for the major rumble happening soon.
Yeah, even they figured out that was a good idea, said Marcel.
Plus they knew you'd be there. But there's urgent bad news. Well over half the team is out of commission.
What?
Marcel, I'm so sorry to have brought you into this.
Forget that, what else was I even doing?
Good show. But what on earth happened? Is Tobias okay?
Yeah, he and that flunky guy are fine.
After the squirrel got you, it dashed off into the shadows. I asked some rats to go look for it, they said they planned to anyway because they'd never seen a squirrel like that before around the sewer. None reported back, and we didn't see any more of it. We left the sewer, knowing there was no way we could catch you, and decided to move on in hopes you wouldn't drown and we'd meet up later.
18 squirrel tits lickers.
The posse staggered out of the sewer. Barry would be halfway to sea by morning. They still couldn't believe it. Where had that massive big-titted squirrel come from? It was mewy confusion. The boys were sore, rubbing bruised joints. They didn't fight wrestlers as tough as this every day. The ragged gang wound and wended back towards their lodgings at the kumquat, through streets dim and shadowy-eyed. And in their hearts, they were becoming shadowy-eyed as well. Marcel was about to break off, to go home, to make sure his affairs were in order before leaving. Something stopped him. The group was acting funny. Boys were staggering around as if drunk. So tired. Tired and exhausted. Their bones stretched to nothing. It was the no-bone zone of twilight ultra-weariness, a morass of putty movement, teeth that felt like rubber, gums like morning foam. And no barrier, now that Barry and Torval were both gone, to giving in to the soul weariness. No father figure. Tobias and Marcel saw it too late. The group was splitting like zombies in all directions. Some were headed to the whorehouses and peep shows, the opium dens and cockfights. They scattered into these various holes before anyone could call to them. But most, by far most, were interested in one thing only: gambling. Marcel and Tobias went from gaming den to gaming den, with Flunky always following, always looking over their shoulder. Zombies. Hopelessness. Gambling had them in abject animality before its terrifying throne, and all outside was drowned out. A few had the audacity to play slots in the kumquat, the very inn where they had promised with heart and soul to be wholesome for the sake of wrestling and family. But it was all wreck and ruin. The willpower can only go so far. Boys need role models. And now, they had none. And they rolled the dice. In pathetic abjection, they turned their backs on everything, turned to the abyss of clinking sounds and neon lights, to the place without light, the hollow excitement. They turned their backs on everything. And then, just as Marcel, Tobias, Flunky, and the four elders left were debating what to do, they appeared. They surrounded the remaining posse members in the dark alley, appearing from nowhere. They were approximately 5 foot 4 inches, give or take. Their smart matching suits made a solid first impression. There was no variation between the attire of any of them. They wore black leather Oxford shoes, about a size 9½. Their double-pleated herringbone slacks had a comfortable-looking wide leg width. Tasteful mauve ties stood out on their white undershirts. Their matching navy shirt and blazers were double-breasted, wide-shouldered, and set off by chrysanthemum boutonnieres affixed invisibly to the left lapel. Atop their heads, black newsboy hats sat jauntily. All in all, it was a class act, a sure sign of diabolical organized crime. This was borne out by their vicious weapons. Each gangster casually swung a razor-sharp sickle from the chains they carried at their sides. Tobias had heard the neo-criminal underworld were Kuzarigama users, but he hadn't believed it. The leader, who looked much like the rest, stepped forward with a sneer. "Well, it looks like we've taken care of your boys, see? And now we're gonna take care of you too. Boris, give 'em the big titty formula. You'll be having big titties in no time, see? Then they'll know it was the Neo-Zo underworld mobsters that got ya. Another conquest, see? It was too horrible to contemplate." Marcel realized that all the T-Town boys who were trapped by gambling and other vices would have been given the formula by now. He'd lived in Neo-Zo long enough to know the truth behind the legends, the coerciveness, the toxicity. Those proud T-Towners would be sitting at slot machines and blackjack tables with big, luscious titties, juicy and round, nipples erect and pointing, getting off to the crippling horror of gambling. The big titty formula had been a godsend, a miracle of science that was vital to those with gender dysphoria, while still possessing a wide range of other applications. The mobsters had taken that great achievement and, through a sick sense of humor that had no regard for consent or dignity, had made it into their branding tool. The shame of the whole thing nearly knocked Marcel down when he thought of it. "We gotta get outta here," he whispered to Tobias. The mobsters swung their Kizarigama faster, approached closer. Marcel and Tobias ran in the direction of the most trafficked street, dodge-rolling desperately and indiscriminately. The rest of the group followed their leads. Sickles flew. Soon the remnants of the T-Town posse were getting cut up, hooked and spun around. Tobias made it into range of a retreating gangster, thwacking the sickle down and stepping on it with his full weight. Then he grabbed the man and threw him in an adept judo maneuver. The gangster flew through the air, his trajectory blocking 3 sickles before they made their targets. The goon then smacked into the wall in a painful tangle of sickles and chains. Tobias picked up the Kizarigama and spun it over his head. The goon with the big titty formula was advancing slowly, his back bent, a wicked grin on his face, the needle held out menacingly in front of him in anticipation. Tobias threw, quick as lightning. The sickle crashed into the needle, shattering it into 1,000 pieces and spraying the formula everywhere. It splashed into the face and chest of the dismayed gangster, causing him to lean back and scream in horror. Then, at an incredible rate, his chest expanded, gigantic boobies ripping open his handsome suit and growing like 2 fleshy nuclear explosions, cyclopean nipples erect and pointing defiantly at the heavens, wriggling to and fro with the pressure of the hot milk that was now erupting from him. The goon shrieked and shrieked and shrieked as his body tried to keep up with the milk production, and still, the tits expanded. In the confusion, the T-Town boys and Marcel made their getaway, not witnessing the gruesome end. "We need to get out of the city immediately," Marcel declared, to no argument. They sprinted full bore back to the kumquat, saddled up the main coach. The proprietor appeared. "How will you gentlemen be settling your bill?" Tobias made motion to the 2 other coaches and accompanying speed mules. The proprietor, observing the speed mules he was getting for next to nothing, nodded his wide-eyed assent. Without even grabbing extra food from the other wagons, they headed out, an elder taking the reins. Puddle water, displaced by rushing carriage. Wheels, splashed and flew in the night. Soon, they were out of the west gate, riding along the wider land bridge towards the dunes and the arid plains. Marcel looked back. Neo-Zo squatted malevolently, the cawing of the crows ringing in the early morning air. Then he noticed a figure. It had rushed out of the closing gates and was desperately chasing after them, a haggard but sturdy T-Town warrior with, Marcel was ashamed to admit, the finest pair of tits he'd ever seen. Just as the figure was coming into shouting distance, Marcel noticed something else. Up on the wall battlements, a number of mobsters were looking down at the figure. But not just looking. Inevitable and cold as death, they pulled out the Tommy guns. The warrior ran, yelled, didn't see what was coming. And the gangsters began to viciously mow him down, filling him utterly full of lead. Sickened and dismayed, Marcel closed his eyes and turned away. The rat-a-tat died down, and soon the sound of the crows recommenced, then faded into distance. Now, telling it in club bizarre, Marcel closed his eyes again. "This is horrid news, horrid indeed," said Barry. "I'm not concerned about the lack of wrestlers. We have enough of an attraction. But fine wrestling boys, snatched away in the prime of their lives, it doesn't matter what town you're from. That's an injustice." He stamped a fist firmly on the table. "Snatched away from us, just like that." It was almost too much for poor Tobias to bear. The elders seemed to age a little, I can't lie, after all that. To think so little stood between those boys and the wages of temptation. None are immune from sin. None from transgression. Marcel closed his eyes. "Man, Barry, you've gotten to me. I really see thing like you now." "He has that effect, I've noticed," said Drip Dry. "A little time spent with Barry starts to make people view things through the lens of wholesomeness and justice." "Yeah," said Barry, "well, there isn't anything just or wholesome about those Neo-Zoo underworld mobster filth. Do you think they might have sent a party to follow you?" "I haven't seen any signs of it, but it can't be ruled out. They don't take kindly to being thwarted. And that goon that Tobias titted was probably fairly high-ranking, to have what they call the honor of administering the big titty formula. Plus, who knows what other motives they might have. What if they know about the shrooms stuff? They could be in cahoots with Central Gov. All true. Has the caravan experienced any mishaps since?" "Where are you now?" "We're just on the road. Been for days. Tobias thinks we'll be in West Pueblos by about 2 days from now. We're keeping our heads down. We haven't seen any sign of any desert tribes or anything. Maybe they're all in town for the rumble already. Even though it is a ways out. Hopefully when we get there, the guys can find some smaller venues to make some pocket change at, and I'll see how much of a rat population there is, and if they have any news. I still have most of the prize money, we've hardly even used any on lodging. And all your gear is in good shape." Barry let out a sigh of relief. "Friend Marcel, you may not know how valuable that gear could be one day. You might have glanced at some of the alchemical theory literature, but if you like, I'll explain to you more of the practice sometime. But for right now, have you tried the ginseng tea yet?" "No, let's get some," said Marcel. "I'm down." "Excellent," said Barry. "We can while away some time before dawn here at Club Bazaar. It will do my spirit good. One more semi-serious item, though. I'd appreciate it if you didn't tell anyone I was traveling with the illustrious Drip Dry Eyes. His ability to scent out traitors is as common knowledge as his legendary atomic drop plus clothesline hot dog smasher combo. Of course, I don't imagine there's a traitor in the remaining group. But it doesn't hurt to have all of one's available tools at the ready, just in case." Barry awoke in the plain grey morning of the arid regions, feeling more refreshed than even after that first night at the Grande Old Galvanite Inn. Even so, he couldn't put the despair of those T-Town boys entirely out of his thoughts. They had failed, it was true. They were now lumpen proletariat, but he had a hard time looking at it that way. He found Pardoilios downstairs digging into a complete Huevos Rancheros. Getting in the spirit, Barry ordered the same, followed shortly by Drip Dry. As the last bite was taken and the belching commenced in earnest, Barry said, "Well, that was great. But we should do our little businesses and get on the road. I'll get some provisions and meet you guys back here in a minute." The general store owner was an affable geezer, from the old school of arid plainsmen, not bloated in the least. The opposite, in fact, he was a veritable big-chinned mummy. Barry smiled pleasantly. "Any news on the big West Pueblos rumble?" he asked. "Will," said the geezer, "tain't so near Tatiha Certate Council lands that we know everything that jizz on there, but word slip out. Parantly, they's fighting for a crown o' sorts." A politically motivated rumble, thought Barry. How curious. It was worth investigating further. He thanked the good man and took his leave with a sack of canned foodstuffs. Soon, the intrepid trio was on the road again, gassing one another merrily as they bounced along on the rickety wagon, off towards the arid unknown. Days passed without incident. A couple of unremarkable inns were stopped at, providing fair beds and better than fair provender. But mostly it was canned food, jouncing along the flat desert road, as things went from arid plains to arid desert. And the heat was unrelenting. Water was the vital lifeline, and the urge to use it too quickly, to simply dump it all out onto one's person for a burst of blessed relief, was the great enemy. The best cure was to have a sip, lie back, conserving energy. Pardoilios kept the reins uncomplainingly. Barry thought the fellow, whose bald head was now thoroughly tanned, might have been losing some weight from perspiration. It would have been more comforting if he was losing weight from outdoor exercise in a place with plentiful hydration. But such were the hardships of travel, the sacrifice of adventure. Drip Dry was lost in memory much of the time, perhaps thinking about his past travels. He never betrayed any emotion in relation to his thoughts. The landscape rolled on, dusty rocks, sparse yucca, a few stunted cacti. Mostly empty desert. And in the distance, huge rock formations, towering above the desert, 10, 20 times wider than they were high, abstract expressions of pure unadulterated rockness, strangely masculine, brutal, belittling, like some Martian topographical ambassador come to Earth to show how brutal rock is supposed to be done. Barry couldn't imagine a landscape less inviting, more expressive of the sentiment, "Don't come here, human. We have nothing for you." It was stone for stone's sake, crag for crag's sake, mountainous and wide in tones of yellow ochre and smoky deep red, not dissimilar from those on Drip Dry's body, but in other ways totally unlike that body, a zone to discourage any living thing, so bleak and uninhabitable that it served as a sort of counter-spiritual relief from the hegemony of living things over so much of the surface of this world, this third rock of the solar system. The crags gave way to the mesas. These were much more aesthetically pleasing, big isolated plateaus atop which life, though cut off from the land below by steep cliffs, continued much as it did down there, with the plants sometimes seeming more numerous atop than they did abottom. The mesas were the spiritual to the crags counter-spiritual. These were rocks with soul, interesting, dreaming rocks that spoke of challenge rather than restriction, unique form rather than endless geological recursion. It was also the sign of the Desertate Council lands, domain of a proud tribal conglomerate not to be trifled with. Barry had heard that they disliked being referred to as desert tribes, and seeing the understated desert beauty of these deeper lands, he didn't wonder that whoever peopled it could be prideful of their title as such. But there was none to ask, at least not yet. Upon arrival, there was no sign of human habitation anywhere, to the far horizon. Yet it wouldn't be long before the crew would make it to Confluence Gulch, a small town with an inn and saloon, as well as a moderate population, as many as 800 permanent desert dwellers. Barry had read that might have keener insight into the goings-on around here. "I'm bored," Pardoilios moaned after a week of uncomplaining silence. "Are we there yet?" The road began to wind as the terrain became more rolling. Yucca were now much more prevalent, cacti appearing in many more varieties and growing to greater heights. The wagon followed a long curve that began taking it downhill, the first noticeable elevation shift since nearly the beginning of the journey. Pardoilios squinted. Coming into visibility around the bend, was that a body? He drew the cart closer, then urged the speed mules to the little bit of available space on the side of the dirt road. There were a good many figures lying in the dust. It appeared unconscious rather than dead, but it was hard to be sure. They sprawled on the road, to the sides, and on up the incline, a path of bodies in all positions of repose. They looked like tough tribesmen, wearing clothing made almost entirely of coyote skins. Drip Dry was now peering over. "If there are many of these guys around, it's a wonder coyotes don't go extinct." "Hardy-looking characters," said Barry,
gazing with the calmly quizzical expression he wore when strategizing. Looking around to ensure there were no nearby thieves, the trio disembarked from their worn vehicle and began cautiously pacing forward, keenly attentive to details, with a detective's mindset. "These guys are knocked out, not dead," said Pardoilios. "Definitely wrestling injuries," said Drip Dry. They scaled the small incline. Barry looked back, still no sign of thieves. He looked forward, down the path of unconscious Hardys. Faith and Begorra. It was San Wordle, in the flesh.